The historical evolution of Indian foreign policy from Nehruvian idealism to the Modi doctrine. Introduction. Strategic adaptation as the core logic of Indian foreign policy. The evolution of Indian foreign policy reflects a calculated process of adaptation shaped by structural pressures in the international system, domestic constraints, leadership preferences, and evolving conceptions of national interests. From the early years of independence under Jawaharlal Nehru to the contemporary phase associated with Narendra Modi, India's external behavior demonstrates a pattern of incremental adjustments rather than abrupt doctrinal rupture. The transformation from alignment to multi-alignment doesn't represent ideological inconsistency, but rather a rational recalibration of policy instruments to preserve strategic autonomy and enhance India's position within the hierarchy of states. As the global distribution of power shifts from bipolarity to multipolarity, Indian foreign policy has consistently attempted to maximize room for maneuver while avoiding binding alliance commitments that could constrain long-term sovereignty. The continuity in objectives combined with the variation in strategic tools highlights the realist foundations underlying India's foreign policy traditions. Intellectual foundations of Indian foreign policy. Indian foreign policy emerged with the within the intellectual environment of post-colonial state formation, where the leadership sought to reconcile development and priorities with geopolitical vulnerabilities. The Nehruvian vision of international politics emphasized peaceful coexistence, anti-colonial solidarity, and multilateral cooperation, as well as resistance to bloc politics. Non-alignment was conceived not as passive neutrality but as instrument to protect sovereign decision-making from coercive pressure of competing superpower blocs. This strategy aimed to preserve policy flexibility, enabling India to extract economic and technological benefits from multiple partners without becoming strategically dependent on any singular power center. Scholars have argued that the early orientation of Indian foreign policy was deepened and deeply influenced by both normative commitments to international law and pragmatic calculations concerning national capacity limitations. Kenneth Walt's structural realist framework provides insight into the constraints shaping India's early foreign policy choices. The international system, characterized by unequal distribution of capabilities, imposed limits on the behavior of states regardless of ideological preferences. India's attempts to remain outside military alliances represented an effort to preserve autonomy within a hierarchical global order dominated by superpowers. The emphasis on sovereignty and non-intervention was consistent with the strategic requirement of protecting national independence during a period of domestic consolidation and economic fragility. Continuity and change in the post-Cold War era. The end of Cold War generated a systematic transformation that altered the incentives facing Indian policymakers. The collapse of bipolarity eliminated the structural basis of non-alignment as originally conceived, compelling India to reassess its external posture. Economic liberalization in the early 1990s further linked foreign policy to domestic development priorities. Reinforcing the instrumental character of diplomatic engagement, the shift towards pragmatic engagement with global markets. International institutions, regional powers reflected the growing recognition that economic strength constitutes fundamental component of geopolitical influence. Scholars have noted that Indian foreign policy adjustment during this period didn't represent abandonment of autonomy, but rather a redefinition in a context characterized by globalization and interdependence. The transition from ideological positioning to interest-based engagement marked the gradual emergence of strategic realism as a dominant orientation. The evolution towards multi-alignment demonstrates the willingness of Indian policymakers to engage simultaneously with multiple power centers in order to diversify strategic options and reduce vulnerability to external coercion. The Modi doctrine, assertive realism, and strategic signaling. The contemporary phase of Indian foreign policy is frequently associated with the assertive posture that emphasizes national interest, status recognition, and geopolitical relevance. Under the leadership of Sri Narendra Damodar Das Modi, India has sought to position itself as a major power capable of shaping global governance outcomes. The articulation of India's role as a civilizational state and potential Vishwaguru reflects an attempt to project normative influence alongside material capacity. Such symbolic framing serves reputational objectives, enhancing India's visibility within international forums while reinforcing domestic politics' legitimacy. Policy initiatives during the period revealed continuity with earlier strategies combined with increased willingness to employ diplomatic activism. The transformation of Look East policy into the Act East policy illustrates a shift from rhetorical engagement towards operational commitment in the Indo-Pacific region. Maritime security initiatives such as Sagar demonstrates recognition of the strategic importance of sea lanes for economic growth and power protection, strengthening of partnerships with the United States and participating in forums such as the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, indicating a recalibration of threat perception in response to China's expanding regional influence. Hosting the G20 summit provided an opportunity for India to signal its capacity to assume leadership responsibilities within global governance institutions. Such diplomatic performances function as instruments of status maximization, reinforcing perceptions of India as an indispensable actor in addressing transnational challenges. The emphasis on vaccine diplomacy during the COVID-19 pandemic further illustrates the integration of humanitarian assistance with strategic communications objectives, enabling India to expand its soft power influence across developing regions. Multi-alignment as hedging strategy. The concept of multi-alignment represents the central strategic innovation in contemporary Indian foreign policy. Rather than adhering to rigid alliance structures, India seeks to cultivate relationships with multiple major powers simultaneously. This approach reflects a rational hedging strategy designed to maximize autonomy under conditions of uncertainty. By maintaining cooperative relations with both the United States and Russia, India attempts to avoid entrapment within polarized geopolitical blocs. The cautious response to the Russia Ukraine conflict illustrates the application of strategic ambiguity as a mechanism for preserving policy flexibility. India's continued engagement with Russia in the energy and defense sector demonstrates the persistence of historical partnerships while expanding cooperation with Western states reflect recognition of shifting power balances. The refusal to enter formal alliance commitments underscores the enduring priority assigned to sovereign decision making. Statements emphasizing permanent, non alliance orientation indicate the institutionalization of strategic autonomy as a guiding principle in foreign policy formulation. The logic underlying multi alignment is consistent with realist expectations regarding multi power behavior in multipolar systems. States possesses significant but not dominant capabilities seek to avoid overdependence on stronger actors while extracting benefits from multiple relationships. India's foreign policy behavior reflects this pattern, balancing engagement with deterrence while preserving maneuverability. Domestic constraints and international credibility. Despite ambitions for enhanced global influence, India faces significant domestic constraints that limit its capacity to translate strategic intent into effective outcomes. Scarcity of financial resources constraints defense modernization, and diplomatic outreach, while domestic political controversies generate reputational costs that affect international partnerships. Allegations concerning democratic backsliding, restrictions on media freedom, and minority rights issues have attracted international scrutiny, potentially undermining India's normative appeal as a democratic model. Internal socio-economic disparities also complicate the projection of external power as domestic development challenges absorb policy attention and fiscal resources. The interaction between domestic governance and policy credibility highlights the interconnected nature of internal stability and international influence. Aspirations to achieve great power status require sustained economic growth, institutional resilience, and social cohesion, all of which remain subject to structural constraints. COVID-19 and the politics of soft power. The COVID-19 pandemic represented a significant taste of India's capacity to integrate humanitarian diplomacy with strategic objectives. The distribution of vaccines under the principle of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam symbolized India's attempt to cultivate regional goodwill while reinforcing its image as a responsible global actor. Vaccine diplomacy served as an instrument of influence within South Asia and beyond, enabling India to counteract China's expanding presence in developing regions. However, the emergence of domestic health crises during subsequent waves of the pandemic exposed vulnerabilities in the state capacity, raising questions concerning the sustainability of external commitments. The tension between domestic needs and international responsibilities illustrates the structural trade-off inherent in foreign policy decision making. States seeking international recognition must allocate resources between internal development and external engagement, often facing opportunity costs that constrain policy choices. Strategic culture and the persistence of autonomy. India's strategic culture has historically emphasized independence in decision making and skepticism towards an alliance entanglements. The persistence of autonomy as a core principle reflects both historical experience and structural necessity. Colonial subjugation generated sensitivity to external dominance, reinforcing the persistence for policy flexibility. The adaptation of this principle to contemporary conditions demonstrates the resilience of strategic culture in shaping foreign policy trajectories. While policy instruments evolve in response to systematic changes, underlying preferences for autonomy remain stable. The movement from non-alignment to multi-alignment illustrates the modification of strategy rather than transformation of identity. India continues to pursue recognition as an independent pole within the global order, seeking to balance relations with competing powers without sacrificing sovereign discretion. India's aspiration for great power status, the ambition to emerge as a leading power, constitutes a recurring theme in Indian foreign policy discourse. The pursuit of recognition within global governance institutions reflects the desire to influence rulemaking processes and shape engagement in regional security initiatives, indicate efforts to expand India's strategic footprint. However, aspirations for systematic influence require sustained accumulation of material capacities, including economic growth, technological innovation, and military modernization. The gap between ambition and capacity represents a persistent challenge in India's quest for global status. Achieving great power recognition necessitates consistent policy execution from multiple domains, including domestic governance reform, economic competitiveness, and diplomatic coordination. Conclusion: incremental transformation within structural constraints. The historical evolution of Indian foreign policy demonstrates a pattern of continuity in objectives combined with adaptation in methods. The transition from Nehruvian idealism to Modi's assertive realism reflects adjustments to changing systemic conditions rather than abrupt ideological transformation. Strategic autonomy remains the central organizing principle guiding India's engagement with multiple power centers while avoiding binding alliance commitments. India's foreign policy trajectory reveals the influence of structural constraints, domestic priorities, and leadership perceptions in shaping external behavior. The adoption of multi-alignment as a hedging strategy indicates recognition of the uncertainties associated with emerging multipolarity. While ambitions for enhanced global influence continue to drive policy initiatives, the realization of great power status depends upon the successful management of domestic challenges and external relationships. The evolution of Indian foreign policy thus represents an ongoing process of strategic recalibration aimed at maximizing autonomy, enhancing status and security national interests with an increasingly complex international system. The interplay between continuity and change highlights the pragmatic character of Indian diplomacy, underscoring the importance of flexibility in navigating shifting geopolitical landscapes.